Welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be a continuation of the battle in Europe. And so we're heading towards VE Day or Victory in Europe Day. And we left off in the previous lecture in part one, discussing the invasion at Normandy, how Hitler was tricked into believing that the attack was going to happen at Calais, that the German defenses just weren't prepared for the attack at Normandy. We see most of the beaches at Normandy are going to fall without too much of a hiccup. We know that Utah Beach was relatively undefended, but at Omaha Beach there was some really tough fighting. The cliffs there made it very difficult for those soldiers to be able to take that beach. Plus, they just, one of those weird things that happens sometimes in history. The American troops are just very unfortunate that, most of the soldiers that were in Normandy at the time were kind of second rate or third rate soldiers, but some elite units from the Eastern Front were actually on vacation at Omaha Beach when the Americans landed there. And so, the fighting ends up being much tougher because of that situation. And so eventually we are able to establish a beachhead in Normandy. And then most of the generals thought that what happened next would be, we would be able to swing through cities like Cannes and St. Lo, and then eventually get to Paris relatively quickly. What the Allied generals didn't fully anticipate, and which ended up being a pretty serious intelligence failure, is the battle for the hedgerows. The French countryside is, it's ancient farmland. And so from, the time before fences were, cheaply mass produced, farmers fenced in their property by essentially creating these gigantic mounds of dirt and then fencing them in with shrubbery. And now, you tell all the Monty Python jokes you want, bring me a shrubbery. When I say shrubbery, I don't just necessarily mean a bush. I mean, a system of bushes and trees that are hundreds of years old, if not 1,000 years old. And so it's extremely thick. It's got this super, thick root structure that is, leaves these things in place. These are the type of things that you can't just easily cut your way through. These shrubs will actually stop a tank dead in its tracks. And so what happens is that the farmland and the shrubs around the farmland, the hedgerows around the farmland, create like kind of a grid pattern, essentially all the way from Normandy to Paris. And it makes ambushing really easy. So comparatively few German soldiers can kind of hide behind these shrubs. And if the Allies try to use the main roads, when they drive past one of these shrubberies, one of these hedgerows, the Germans can pretty easily attack them and massacre those Allied soldiers. So what ends up having to happen is that the Allies have to clear each one of these hedgerows one at a time. And so, like, for example, you might have up to 37 hedgerows per mile. And so, very few German soldiers can hold a hedgerow against seriously superior Allied soldiers for hours, half a day, a full day. And then once they realize that the German soldiers can't hold it anymore, they just retreat back to the next hedgerow. And so it makes for very slow going, where relatively few Germans can hold off a superior number of Allied soldiers. And this ends up being very disastrous for the Allies. And so the Allies have to try and kind of figure out, well, how do we get past these hedgerows? And they're going to try a whole host of different things. One of the things that they do is, they try to cut through the hedgerows. Well, that doesn't work out so well because it takes time and all the noise. It's slow going. It creates a lot of noise. And so the Germans know then, where you're trying to break through. And as soon as you cut a hole in, through big enough to get a person through, the Germans can just, concentrate their fire there, and that ends up being disastrous. So they try and do it quicker to get through the hedgerows by blowing them up. Well, you can't just throw a grenade at it. You throw a grenade or, a stick of dynamite at it. That's just not going to be powerful enough to get through these hedgerows. So they start to dig holes in the ground and throw the dynamite in, and then, light the dynamite, throw it in, and then have it explode and try and blast through it real quick and then rush the soldiers through. The problem with that is when you dig a hole and then put the dynamite in the hole, if you don't cap the hole, the explosive force is going to find the easiest route out, which is kind of back on the Allied soldiers. And so that ends up not working. And so it really is this super arduous, difficult, long-lasting process to break through all these hedgerows, and it's going to cost a lot of allies their life, and more importantly, I think it's slowing down the process, which gives Hitler and the Axis powers more time to prepare and defend. Now, eventually, what will happen is that the Allies will start to equip tanks with, the proper equipment to be able to just kind of plow through some of the hedgerows. But most importantly, what happens is that General Patton. Remember General Patton from our previous lecture? He's the tank guy, right? Who, because he slapped a soldier, had the Seventh Army taken away from him. Patton at this point is going to be allowed back in the game, right? Instead of just being a decoy for Operation Fortitude, now that everything is rolling in Europe, people recognize really quick that we need what is probably our best general actually out fighting Nazis. And so Patton will be given the 3rd Armored Division. And so he's got a brand new army, and once he's put back in charge and he's given tanks, essentially what he does is he's kind of takes the southern route in France and swings through, where General Montgomery, the British general, is essentially stuck in the northern region, hasn't been able to make much progress. Patton just slams through. And, as he's making progress, he's sweeping up gigantic portions of France and is on his way towards the Paris region. So we really have Patton to thank for the breakthrough here. At the same time that this is going on and we're fighting through the hedgerows, a combined American and French force is going to invade southern France through the Mediterranean, and we essentially now have a pincer movement that's trying to meet in the middle. So after we bust through the hedgerow, the next big target is going to be Paris. Now, initially, Paris really wasn't on Eisenhower's radar. It doesn't serve a super important strategic purpose. It's, Eisenhower would really just rather go around it. He doesn't want to slow down his progress. He wants to build that momentum. But the French resistance leader, Charles de Gaulle, makes a compelling argument to Eisenhower that the French resistance in Paris are, the majority of them are communist supporters. And so, de Gaulle essentially tells Eisenhower, look, if we don't liberate Paris and we allow the communists to do it themselves, that will give communists a foothold in Paris, and we don't want that. And so, when De Gaulle makes that argument, he essentially says, French leaders need to be the ones that take the capital of Paris. Even though it's not strategically important, it is symbolically significant. And so, what ends up happening is Eisenhower says, yes, okay, and a French contingent supported by American forces will start to head towards Paris. Now, a couple of things have to happen. We still have to take the city of St. Lo. That is an important crossing. It's got a bridge that can get past the St. Lo River, and that's super important. And once again, it's going to be Patton and the Third Army that is going to just plow through the German forces. They're going to be able to, with the help of the Air Force, are going to be able to take the city of St. Lo, which is going to give us the Allies, I should say, a clear path on to Paris. Now, everybody has concerns about the city of Paris. Paris is the cultural center for the West, right? I mean, yes, it's the capital of France, but it's more important than that. France, for a long time, has been, as far as the Western countries and democratic countries go, Paris is the cultural epicenter for the Western democracies. It is one of the most important art cities in the world, right? You've got the Louvre, the d'Orsay, Rodin, all of that stuff is in Paris. It's a architectural center, right? You've got Notre Dame, you've got the Eiffel Tower, just all kinds of Montmartre. You got all kinds of important architectural buildings. It's it's one of the musical centers. It's one of the literary centers. It's definitely one of the culinary centers, epicenters for the entire world. And so people are concerned that if we take Paris and don't just go around it, that what Hitler will do is just destroy it rather than have it fall into the hands of the French. And that is Hitler's plan. He actually orders his troops to lay explosives across the city, underneath the Eiffel Tower and, underneath all the cultural centers, the museums, the churches, all of that stuff, and, to blow them up before the Germans retreat. Now, fortunately for history and for, the rest of the world today, the general in charge in Paris decides not to follow that order. And not following one of Hitler's orders can be a death sentence. So, the guy's, risks everything because he doesn't want to be remembered throughout history as the guy who destroyed Paris. He'd rather be remembered as the guy who saves Paris. And so ultimately, 3 months after D-Day, the people of the city of Paris rise up, and the French, assisted by the Americans, are able to take Paris back. And this is a huge PR victory and, a great thing for France in general. And so what we start to see as, these European cities start to get liberated is, the people celebrating Americans as heroes. Charles de Gaulle in France is now, like this almost godlike figure, the savior of France, and the people starting to turn on any potential Nazi sympathizers. Remember from a previous lecture, there were not sympathetic French people, that people that were sympathetic to the Nazis, called the Vichy French. And so, if you were, a man who helped the Nazis while the Nazis occupied France, you could be beaten or killed or put in jail, have your house taken from you, property confiscated and whatnot. If you were a woman in France and then later Belgium, when we free Belgium, and you were sympathetic to the Nazis, you could see scenes like this in essentially every major city, where the women were essentially hauled out into the city center, and would, a lot of times have their clothes ripped off to, their nightgown, or worse, or their undergarments, I should say, and then have their head shaved for having bad relations with occupying German soldiers. And so essentially they're saying you slept with a Nazi, or you provided aid to a Nazi, and so we want everybody to know who you are, and we want you to live with your shame. And so I think a lot of people listening to this are like, yeah, they helped the Nazis, and who cares if it's a little public humiliation? Well, it's not just public humiliation. These women would be beat, they'd be spit on. But once they're publicly identified like that, they're going to have trouble finding a job. They're going to have trouble, getting their kids into school and things of that nature. So it's more than just public humiliation. But the other thing I would really like to point out, and I would want you to think about, is think about a woman in any kind of Western civilization in the 1940s. How many options does she have? Right? This woman here, and I don't know her actual backstory, but I can tell you this. I know the backstory of the average woman in this woman's position. Her husband probably went off to war to fight and was either killed or taken prisoner. Remember, the French army just fell apart in the very beginning of this thing. Maybe her husband fled the country to fight in the resistance, or whatever. But she's alone on her own now. And how's she going to support herself? Right? I mean, how's she going to find a job? Women are excluded from many of the jobs that are available to men, and so she doesn't have that option in the best of times. But when the Nazis take over, it's not like they go around hiring people and giving them raises. The Nazis are trying to fight a war, and they're trying to keep the costs as low as possible. And so, although some of the men will be able to keep their jobs in shops or factories or whatever, the Nazis are using Jews as slave labor, and prisoners of war as slave labor. And so it's not like the economic environment is great for anybody. And so it's even worse for women. And so a lot of these women have a real serious choice to make, unless they come from a family of means, or somehow their husband or father is able to take care of them. They've got a tough choice to make. Either starve and let their children starve, or they could attach themselves to a German soldier. And that German soldier would and essentially be a war wife for one of these German soldiers. And that German soldier then would make sure that she got, a was able to get food for herself and for her kids, or find her an actual paying job, or could intimidate her landlord into not charging her rent. And so a lot of these women aren't actually Nazi sympathizers. As a matter of fact, I would wager to guess, and would just be a guess, but I would wager to guess that most of these women don't like the Nazis at all. They find what they're doing distasteful, but at the end of the day, their will to survive is greater than their distaste for this situation. So when I look at this picture, I don't feel like, oh, sweet revenge. I look at it and I just feel pity. I feel pity for everybody involved, because there are victims of war from wartime that a lot of times aren't the ones that you think about right away. Right? I mean, they're not the soldier who loses his life or his arm. It's not the typical victim. Sometimes it's just people making decisions that tough decisions that end up having to pay a price for that later. And so this is a scene that is unfortunately all too common all across Europe. So now, after Paris, we're going to see, the next year, we're going to see some really quick advances made on the Western Front by the Allies. But Hitler's not done fighting yet. He's got one more big offensive plan that he wants to try and to actualize. And that's going to be the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge is going to be a surprise attack by Hitler. This is going to be his last big offensive push. So he's going to take all of his resources, pool them together, and try to smash through the Allied lines, cut them in half, race out to the ocean, and hopefully you'd be able to surround a significant portion of the Allied forces. And he believes if he can do that, then he will be able to negotiate for I shouldn't say negotiate for some kind of peace, because that's not really what he's going to do, but he thinks that if he can smash through the lines, cut the Allied forces in half, and surround the significant portion of those troops, that he still has the ability to pull out a victory. And so the Battle of the Bulge will happen from December 16th to January 25th. And, it's initially going to be very successful for Hitler. Like I said, it's the last German offensive of the war. And Hitler's plan is to bust through the Ardennes, which is a thickly wooded forest in Europe, and to push all the way up to Antwerp, cutting Allied forces in half. The American troops are going to be caught off guard. Again, attacking through the Ardennes is tough, and people don't think it's possible. Germany's done it several times now. There really shouldn't be a problem. But the attack, I don't think anybody really kind of thought that Hitler had enough forces to do this. So what will happen is that the German forces will just smash into the Allied lines, catch us off guard, and the Germans are going to be able to, because they caught us unprepared, they're going to be able to snatch up about 60 miles of territory. This is why they call it the Battle of the Bulge. There's a line, a front, right, where in that line, what's happening is the Allies are pushing more and more into Germany, right? They're moving more and more into Germany. But when Hitler attacks, boom, he creates this big bulge. I should say pushing, I can't ever figure out this camera, right? We're pushing further and further and further into Germany. And as we do that, when Hitler attacks, bam, he busts through the lines about 60 miles and creates a big bulge. You'll see, I shouldn't do that with my hands because I'm camera, it's tough. But you'll see on the next slide an actual map showing the area that the Germans are able to take. Now, the Germans will be slowed down because their supply lines get overextended, and then winter hits. There's this deep winter snow that makes the mechanized units difficult to move, and so that kind of slows everything down until you get essentially a stalemate. The American Air Force, the British, Air Force, the RAF, and the German Luftwaffe are going to be kept out of the fight because of the bad weather, and there's so much cloud cover and so much snow that the planes aren't going to really be able to be used. And then we're going to see a stalemate set in. Now, eventually, because of the bravery of American troops, and in particular the 101st Airborne, we're going to see that the Allies are going to be able to push back, and Hitler will lose those gains. So eventually, Allied troops will be able to break through. So here's a map of the front, and so that shaded area is area under German control, and then the darker shaded area, and you can see the front line is that black line. So those arrows are what the German plan is. Bust through the Ardennes and then head all the way up to Antwerp in Belgium. And so if you can do that, you will break through the lines. You'll cut off supplies to the northern part of Allied troops, and that would be a massive German victory. Well, the shaded area is as far as they get. So when you're looking up in the corner right over here, that all that shaded area that includes Luxembourg and all the way up to Bastogne, that's the bulge. That's how much territory Germany's able to get back. It's going to be at Bastogne that we're going to see a lot of the toughest fighting. And, the regular army troops at Bastogne are going to be forced to retreat. They're going to run out of supplies. They're going to run out of ammunition. And it's at that time, fighting in the conditions pictured above right there, that the 101st is going to be called in. And so when the 101st is moving in, the regular troops are moving out, and the 101st is going to be expected to hold Bastogne against a massive artillery barrage that is essentially going to just deforest the area. And the 101st is just scantily prepared for what's about to happen. They just don't have enough, scantily supplied, I should say, for what's about to happen. But the 101st refuses to give in. They're going to hold on, and then they hold on just enough, just as soon as it looks like that they're not going to be able to hold anymore. It's almost as if God intervenes, because the clouds part, the heaven opens up, and at that point, all of a sudden now the American Air Force and the British Air Force can provide some relief. They can provide some cover fire, which is exactly what's needed. And then at the same time, it's going to be once again General Patton that's going to be able to bust through and save the day. When Patton shows up with his tanks, the fight's now a fair fight, and we're going to be able to start to push back any advances that Hitler has and the Nazis have made. And so this is really I'm not going to say it's the beginning of the end, because we've said that in previous lectures, right? Stalingrad is probably really the beginning of the end, and the Normandy is the beginning of the end. This is the Battle of the Bulge. This is really, we're starting to get to the end of the end. The writing is clearly on the wall. Once we break through here, we're going to see rapid advancement. And so, this ends up being the largest land battle of the war, right? So the biggest swings. This is going to be up until this point in history, this is the largest battle American forces have ever been in. I mean, this is going to be land battle. That the American forces have ever been in, and will ultimately be a success. 81,000 American casualties, 23,000, 24,000 captured, and 19,000 killed. But 100,000 German men were either killed or captured or wounded. Those numbers look relatively equal, but American allies definitely come out on top for two reasons. One, our lines held. We didn't complete, Germany was never able to completely break through, and, we were able to capture all that territory back. But more importantly, even though the numbers of killed, wounded, captured are relatively similar, Germany can't afford those losses as much as the Allies can. Now that America's involved in the war, we just have, again, in a war of attrition, we have more people and we have more supplies now. And so those losses don't hurt us as much. So the next target after the fall of Berlin is going to be, after we save it, Bastogne is going to be Berlin. So now it's just a race to Berlin. So the Americans and the British are going to be pushing from the west, and the Soviets are going to be pushing from the east. And both sides want Berlin. And so Eisenhower, who's the Supreme Allied Commander at this point, so he's the head dude in charge, he's kind of making these decisions. And both sides want to be the one that take Berlin. Now, people are kind of hoping that Hitler will just give up. He's not going to. Hitler is, going to fight to the bitter end. Even though his best troops are gone, by the time we get to Berlin, it's really essentially old people and Hitler Youth that are going to be defending the city. The Hitler Youth, as a matter of fact, are going to do some of the toughest fighting. I mean, these are kids that have been indoctrinated their entire lives into the cult of Hitler. And so they've been told their entire lives that to die for Hitler and the fatherland is the best thing that they can do. And so they'll fight ferociously and almost without fear because of that. And so both sides are, the Soviets and the Americans are racing to get to Berlin first. And the idea is there that whichever side controls Berlin is going to be able to control Germany once the war is over. And so you really have two different ideologies racing for Berlin to try and determine the future of not only Germany, but of Europe after the war. And so both sides racing to Berlin, who's going to control it? The capitalist democracies of Great Britain, France, and America, or the communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union? And so both sides are racing in, and Eisenhower ultimately is going to make a very strategic decision here, and one that he'll be criticized for later, by guys like Eugene McCarthy, but even serious people will criticize him for this. He's going to make the decision to allow the Soviets to take Berlin. And it's not because he's sympathizing with communists, but it's because he understands Stalin. I think at this point, Eisenhower knows that the Soviet Union has made the majority of sacrifices for this war, right? In lives and material. And I mean, they've just made massive sacrifices. And, if you want to really upset Stalin, then the West should take Berlin. And then Stalin will feel like he's been betrayed. And then there'll be this seething animosity after the war. Eisenhower knows there's going to be tension after the war. The communists and the democratic capitalists are not going to be friendly when this war is over. And so he's really kind of afraid, as well as a lot of other people are very afraid that, we might end the war with Germany and then go right into war with the Soviet Union. And so he wants to avoid that. And so what he's going to do is he's going to make a decision that's going to be very costly for the German people. And he's going to decide to allow the Soviet Union to enter Berlin first. Now, this is going to be devastating for the people of Berlin. The Soviet army hasn't been paid in months, and in some cases, some people at all. And the Soviets are angry. They're very upset with the way that the Nazis treated the Soviets in the territory they had captured throughout the war. The Einsatzgruppen in particular, we'll talk about them in a future lecture about the Holocaust, massacred entire villages. And so the Soviets are angry, seething angry, and they haven't been paid in a long time. And Stalin essentially issues an order that once they get to Berlin, that as part of their payment, they can just take out their anger and frustration on the people of Berlin. And so steal what you want, kill what you want, rape what you want. And you're going to have a situation where the Soviets take the city. And as they take the city, they're stealing, killing, and raping as they please. And so, if you're a German woman or even German child, you're really at risk of, either being killed if you're a male or raped if you're a woman. And, hundreds of thousands of women are going to be raped. It's a devastating thing that happens to Berlin, and something that the West, that we really kind of expect is probably going to happen if we let the Soviets take Berlin. But again, you've got to make a decision, and it's either let these horrible things happen to this one city or potentially go right into World War III. And Eisenhower makes the tough decision. Was it the right one? I don't know. I suspect it's probably the best decision that he felt he could make. And so Russia's allowed to be the first to enter Berlin. Hitler and his girlfriend, Eva Braun, will go down to a bunker and commit suicide after Hitler has instructed the defenders of the city to hold on and to fight to the last man and not to give up and not to surrender. By May 7th, 1945, after Hitler has killed himself, Germany will finally unconditionally surrender. And then VE Day is declared the following day on May 8th. VE just stands for Victory in Europe. So, this is the last known picture of Adolf Hitler. These are young German soldiers fighting for the Wehrmacht, the German army. You can tell these kids, are, I don't know, I'm terrible with kids' ages, but, some of these kids defending their 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, asked to defend and, fight for their country to the death. And many of them will. These essentially this is right before he goes in the bunker to kill himself. And he just is sending these kids on a death mission, a suicide mission, if you will. The Soviets, when they enter the city, aren't going to spare anybody, particularly people that are fighting back. I mean, some of the people taking the city, the Soviets, they're the most battle hardened soldiers. The Soviets have women fighting for them, and the women are like have a reputation for being even crazier than the men, and so super tough fighting. And so Berlin is just going to be, destroyed as the Soviets rampage through the city. And, once Berlin falls, that's going to essentially be the conclusion of the war in Europe. And it's going to be at this point that America can really kind of turn and focus its attention on Japan. We've been fighting in the Pacific during the war in Europe, but we've not really given it our full attention. It's going to be at this point that we're going to be able to give the war in the Pacific our full attention and start fighting Japan. So the war's not over, but this part of the war is. All right, that concludes today's lecture. The next lecture will be on the war in the Pacific. Thank you very much for your time.